It starts with a lie. A get-rich-quick scheme, really, cooked up by two scammers in 17th century China. They approached this notoriously corrupt official, right, with an incredible story. On the island of Luzon, in the Spanish Philippines, there was this mountain made of pure gold.
Pure fantasy.
Totally. But the tale, it was so tantalizing, it somehow makes its way all the way up to the Wanli Emperor. Now, this guy, his imperial treasury is basically running on fumes.
He needed cash badly.
Exactly. So in a move that completely bypasses his own skeptical ministers, he actually dispatches an official mission to Manila. This is 1603. Their job, simple, find the gold mountain.
Well, when the Chinese delegation actually lands in Manila, the Spanish governor, he has absolutely no clue what he's looking at.
Yeah, he just sees these guys, envoys from the emperor of the mighty Ming dynasty, and they're just like digging up baskets of dirt.
He must have looked completely bizarre.
So he and his men, they jump to this single terrifying conclusion. This isn't some treasure hunt. This has got to be reconnaissance. Recon for a full-scale invasion.
And just like that, a con man's story ignites this firestorm of paranoia.
And that paranoia, it ends with the slaughter of nearly 25,000 people. It's this forgotten chapter in a long history of violence that, well, was really just getting started there. Welcome to the deep dive. For this deep dive, we're drawing on, colonial chronicles, economic research, military analysis. And our mission here is really to move past just the chaotic surface of the incident itself.
Yeah.
The 1603 massacre. It wasn't just some isolated riot sparked by, simple confusion.
No, it really wasn't. It was more like an inevitable explosion, wasn't it? Deeply rooted in, structural collapse. That's the core idea we really need to unpack here. We're dissecting the failure of two massive empires simultaneously. On one side, you've got the Spanish Empire. It's paralyzed by its own logistical limits, this deep-seated paranoia, totally unable to actually execute its grand vision for Asia.
And the other side.
The Ming dynasty, so consumed by its own financial ruin, internal threats, rebellions, that it basically stood silent while thousands of its own people were being systematically destroyed overseas.
So the people in Manila, the Chinese diaspora.
Caught right in the middle, crushed in the gap between these two failing empires.
Okay, let's start with the Spanish side of things, because their, frankly, insane overreaction to a story about a gold mountain. It only really makes sense when you understand what they thought Manila was supposed to be.
Exactly. It wasn't just a place to trade spices.
No, it was supposed to be this military outpost for a dream that, let's be honest, was probably doomed from the start.
It's absolutely vital to remember that Spanish Manila was set up, first and foremost, as the strategic staging ground for the Empresa de China, the Enterprise of China.
The Enterprise of China sounds grand.
It was grand. This wasn't some minor ambition. It was the ultimate prize in the whole Spanish global crusade idea.
Yeah.
And the conversion and, the conquest of the massive Ming Empire.
It sounds like pure fantasy looking back now. But you have to remember, in the late 16th century, the Spanish had just, toppled the Aztec and Inca empires against, frankly, incredible odds.
They had momentum and maybe a bit too much confidence.
Yeah, a massive confidence problem, you could say. They genuinely seemed to believe they could just repeat the trick in Asia. What were they even basing that belief on? Seems thin.
Well, they were relying heavily on some very early and honestly deeply flawed reconnaissance.
Okay. Like what?
Like, for instance, this Augustinian friar, Martin de Rada. He was one of the first Western envoys to actually get into China. He comes back in 1569, reports that China is super populous, sure, but not belligerent.
Not belligerent.
China. Well, that was his read. He suggested their armies relied mainly on sheer numbers and sort of basic fortifications. So this led Spanish strategists back in Manila and Madrid to conclude, hey, with our superior discipline, our steel, our guns, military conquest, maybe starting with just one province, is totally feasible.
Wow. So they're taking the American experience and just pasting it onto Asia.
Pretty much. And the proposals that follow, they were ambitious even for a global empire.
The sources mentioned some pretty wild numbers, right?
It's astonishing, really. You have Governor Francisco de Sande writing in 1576. He proposes that a mere 4,000 to 6,000 Spanish soldiers would be enough to conquer a whole Chinese coastal province.
4,000 against Ming China.
I know. And then, fast forward just a decade to 1586. There's a formal council meeting discussing a plan. They're dreaming of mobilizing 20,000 troops. Not just Spanish troops, mind you, drawn from all over the globe.
20,000. Where were they getting these guys?
They actually planned to recruit Japanese mercenaries, Indian soldiers from Portuguese Goa, all to supplement this core Spanish force. It just shows you the scale of the prize they thought was genuinely within their grasp.
Okay, 20,000 sounds slightly more realistic than 4,000, but still. They plan to project that kind of force, what, 25,000 kilometers away?
Yeah.
The logistics alone, I mean, that sounds like a death trap.
And that's exactly what it was. Distance was probably the single most effective defense China had. It was just this merciless, grinding constraint.
24,500 kilometers from Spain.
Right. And even using the most efficient route, they had the Trans-Pacific Link, the famous Manila Galleon connecting the Philippines to New Spain to Mexico.
That still took ages, right?
A round-trip voyage took well over a year, and the attrition rates, they were just monumental.
I remember reading some accounts about the human cost. These voyages weren't just long. They were incredibly lethal.
Oh, yeah. The sources absolutely confirm that. On any given outbound voyage, it was basically standard for 25% of the soldiers and sailors to die before they even reached Manila.
A quarter of them, just dead on the ship.
Scurvy, dysentery, starvation. It was rampant. So imagine trying to assemble an invasion force of, say, 6,000 men, knowing that 1,500 of them would likely be dead before they even set foot on Luzon, let alone got anywhere near the Chinese mainland.
And that's before you even think about reinforcements, munitions, food.
Exactly. The supply chain was even more fragile. Contemporaries described that Manila Galleon route as the greatest and most arduous voyage in the world.
Wow.
It took a massive investment of ships, men, silver, just to keep those few hundred Spanish settlers alive in Manila. So the idea of sustaining a large invasion force 25,000 kilometers away, needing constant resupply of everything, food, gunpowder, steel across the entire Pacific Ocean, it was impossible with 16th century tech.
A logistical nightmare.
The sheer fragility of the logistics alone meant the Empresa de China was always fundamentally a pipe dream.
Okay, so distance and logistics were the sort of internal constraints. What was the big external, the geopolitical constraint that finally hammered the nail in the coffin for this China invasion plan?
Well, the main reason the Empresa de China never actually launched was pretty straightforward. The Spanish Empire's resources, its ships, its money, its best fighting men were completely sucked up by conflicts back in Europe.
The European chessboard always takes priority.
Always. Philip II, the king at the time, was obsessed with crushing Protestantism, fighting the Dutch, challenging England, dealing with France.
And the big one.
The climax, was the failed Spanish Armada in 1588. The absolutely massive financial and military effort they poured into trying to invade England just drained the treasury. It diverted all the ships and veteran troops that had actually been earmarked for Asia.
So the Armada's failure directly impacted the Philippines.
Absolutely. Spanish global ambition got scaled way back. The Grand Crusade in Asia basically got reduced to grim garrison duty in Manila because the empire had these existential fires burning much closer to home.
And okay, let's say hypothetically they had managed to find the resources, scrape together the ships and men. The military reality they would have faced in China was totally different from what they'd seen in the Americas, right?
Yeah.
There was a serious military mismatch.
Oh, completely. That's a crucial point. The Spanish tercios, their infantry formations, were masters of small unit expeditionary combat, perfect for exploiting divisions and, frankly, technological gaps they found among the Aztecs and Incas.
But Ming China wasn't like that.
Not at all. The Ming dynasty commanded this massive, unified, continental army. Estimates vary, but we're talking potentially over 1 million men on the payrolls. And they used highly sophisticated defensive systems.
We tend to have this image, maybe, of 17th century Asia being technologically behind Europe, but that wasn't necessarily true, especially when it came to things like siege warfare.
Not really, no. Ming military tech was surprisingly advanced in key areas. They'd already adopted Portuguese-style matchlock muskets and cannons way back in the early 16th century.
So they had gunpowder weapons.
They did. And they were using coordinated volley fire techniques, developing them kind of in parallel with European armies. But the biggest hurdle for any invader, the fortifications.
The city walls.
Immense. Ming cities were surrounded by these enormous walls, often over 10 meters thick. The kind of siege artillery the Spanish had back in the late 1500s would have really struggled to breach those. It was nothing like the relatively unfortified capitals like Tenochtitlan or Cusco that they'd conquered in the Americas.
So in Asia, Europeans were basically maritime interlopers. They could win battles at sea, maybe take coastal towns, but holding big chunks of territory inland against a power like the Ming.
Almost impossible. They just didn't have the numbers or the sustainable logistics.
Okay, so summing up this part, the Spanish, hemmed in by logistics, distracted by Europe, find themselves stuck in Manila. It's this isolated garrison, permanently feeling vulnerable and nursing this grand failed fantasy about conquering China, which just fuels this dangerous level of paranoia about the huge Ming Empire just across the water.
Precisely. And that vulnerability, that paranoia, sets the stage for everything that happens next with the local Chinese population.
Yeah, that strategic and military weakness really forces us right into the central paradox of Spanish Manila.
Which is?
That the Spanish were weak, they were paranoid, they were financially stretched thin, and yet they deliberately allowed, even encouraged, this massive, indispensable Chinese community to build up right outside their city walls.
Creating an economic tinderbox. Exactly. Because Manila might have been politically Spanish, but economically, practically, it ran entirely on the Chinese presence, the people they called the Sanglais.
And this presence was all tied up with the galleon trade, wasn't it?
It was the absolute engine of the Manila galleon trade. This system, running roughly from 1565 to 1815, it funneled these colossal amounts of silver pouring out of the Americas, from mines in Zacatecas, Potosi, into Manila.
The silver didn't stay there.
No, not really. What was the silver for? It was primarily to buy Chinese goods, silk, porcelain, spices, all sorts of Asian luxury items. These goods were then loaded back onto the galleons, shipped to Mexico, and eventually made their way to Spain.
So the Spanish weren't really trading with the Philippines so much as using Manila as a giant silver for silk exchange point between the Americas and China.
That's a great way to put it. Manila was the middleman, and that meant the Chinese presence wasn't just helpful, it was absolutely non-negotiable for the colony's basic economic survival.
They couldn't function without them.
Not at all. The sources are really clear on this. The Sanglais dominated virtually every single essential trade and industry in the colony.
Like what specifically?
Well, they were the traders, obviously, bringing the goods, but they were also the artisans, the craftsmen. They were the stonemasons building the churches and walls, the tailors, the shoemakers, the bakers making bread, the metalworkers, the bookbinders, even the people repairing the Spanish ships.
So pretty much everything. If a Spanish soldier needed new boots, or a priest needed a book bound, or the governor needed a wall fixed,
a Chinese artisan did the work. The Spanish settlers themselves, they weren't numerous enough, and frankly, many weren't inclined towards those kinds of trades.
Okay, but this creates an immediate and, from the Spanish perspective, kind of horrifying demographic imbalance, right? These few hundred Spanish settlers who actually survived the trip over,
right,
they're suddenly massively outnumbered.
Hugely outnumbered. By 1603, the year of the first big massacre, the Chinese population in and around Manila was estimated at roughly 30,000. Maybe even more. It's hard to be precise.
30,000. And the Spanish settlers?
Maybe 800 to 1,000. And that includes the soldiers in the garrison.
Wow. So you're talking a ratio of upwards of 30 to 1.
Yeah, easily. 30 Chinese residents for every one Spaniard. This extreme minority status, combined with those lingering fears about a Ming invasion we talked about, led directly to Spanish policies designed for, total and, if necessary, violent control.
And the first most obvious step was physical control. Residential segregation.
Yes. The Sanglais were forced to live in a specific walled ghetto called the Parian. It was situated just outside the main fortified Spanish city, Intramuros, within the walls.
The Parian.
Yeah.
And the Chinese had their own name for it.
They did. They often called it Catan, which apparently translates literally as mountain torrent.
A mountain torrent, like a flash flood.
Sort of suggests this place of intense, maybe unpredictable energy and movement, doesn't it? But the Spanish purpose for the Parian was crystal clear. It was military. Keep this overwhelming Chinese population physically separate, contained, and easier to, target if things went bad.
Keep your potential enemy outside the main gates. Makes sense from a paranoid military perspective. But segregation was only one tool. They also used financial control, right? Basically designed to extract wealth from this population they depended on.
Absolutely. The Spanish subjected the Sanglais to all sorts of high discriminatory taxes and fees. The most notorious one was this mandatory annual license fee.
Just for the right to live there.
Pretty much. 8 silver pesos per year, just for the right to reside and work in the colony. This was a heavy burden, especially for laborers and small artisans. It was arbitrary, it was punitive, and it was clearly designed to do two things: extract wealth and constantly remind the Chinese of their precarious dependent status, even while the Spanish depended on them.
This whole setup sounds like a perfect recipe for intense xenophobia and resentment. The Spanish, even though they're politically in charge, are constantly reminded of their dependence on this huge population that they fundamentally fear, and it sounds like resent.
Oh, the resentment comes through loud and clear in the Spanish writings of the time. They felt exposed, vulnerable, constantly worried about being, quote, outnumbered and overrun.
And frustrated because they couldn't set up their own trading posts in China itself.
Exactly. They failed to penetrate the China market directly, so they sort of took out that frustration on the Fujianese merchants who came to Manila. They even coined this phrase, Trompas de China.
Chinese trickery.
Yeah, basically meaning Chinese scams or trickery. They used it to describe what were probably just normal, maybe sharp business practices. It reveals this deep suspicion.
And there's that other phrase, too, the really dark one that captured their fear about Chinese commercial success.
Plata is sangre, silver is blood.
Silver is blood. Chilling.
It really is. It encapsulates the Spanish perception that the Chinese drive for profit was somehow ruthless, predatory, almost vampiric, and fundamentally threatening to the colonial order. Their success wasn't seen as a mutual benefit or a boon to the Spanish crown, but as this dangerous concentration of wealth and power in foreign hands that had to be watched, controlled, and ultimately sometimes violently contained.
So the Parian wasn't just a neighborhood. It was this fragile, constantly simmering situation. Any shock, any rumor could instantly turn that necessary dependence into, well, outright destruction.
Precisely, a tinderbox waiting for a spark.
Okay, so we've got the scene set. A strategically shaky Spanish garrison, perpetually paranoid, utterly dependent on this huge Chinese population that they simultaneously despise, segregate, and tax heavily. Now let's bring in the actual spark. The bizarre 1603 Gold Mountain incident. It's just a stunning example of how cross-cultural misunderstanding, layered onto all that existing tension, leads directly to tragedy.
It really is. And the deep irony is that the true nature of that Chinese mission had nothing to do with invasion plans. It was rooted entirely in corruption and desperation back in Beijing.
Right. This wasn't some official Ming government plot.
Not at all. The whole ridiculous thing was set in motion by that corrupt imperial eunuch we mentioned, Gao Kai. He either believed, or maybe just pretended to believe, this wild story told by two adventurers, Yan Yinglong and Zhang Yi.
The story of the Gold Mountain in Cavite, near Manila.
Exactly. And the Wanli emperor, remember, was so desperate for funds because his formal tax system was basically collapsing.
He bypassed his own officials.
He did. He bypassed his regular ministries, who were probably deeply skeptical, and authorized this investigation himself. His plan. Any gold found wasn't for the state treasury. It was supposed to go directly into his private slush fund, the night coup.
So the whole thing was basically an illegal, off-the-books treasure hunt for the emperor's personal bank account.
That's pretty much it. So this delegation arrives in Manila in March 1603, and of course they're immediately treated with intense suspicion.
Because from the Spanish perspective, the arrival of official envoys from the Emperor of China is a huge deal. It looks serious.
Right, but then these serious envoys, instead of, negotiating trade treaties or delivering diplomatic messages, they just start digging up baskets of dirt around Cavite.
Which must have looked completely nuts to the Spanish governor, Pedro Bravo de Acuña.
He didn't see desperation or a fool's errand. He saw subterfuge. He saw spies.
And even when the Chinese envoys, probably realizing how ridiculous this looked, apparently confessed to the Spanish, look, we don't really believe this gold story either, but the emperor ordered it, so we have to go through the motions. Even that didn't calm the Spanish down.
No, by then the paranoia was already way too entrenched. The Spanish misinterpretation was just catastrophic.
And it was fueled by high-ranking officials like the Archbishop.
Yeah, Archbishop Miguel de Benavides. He publicly, loudly voiced these fears. He declared that this delegation had to be a probe, a military reconnaissance mission, softening things up for a full-scale Ming invasion.
And given that 30-to-1 population ratio,
that fear spread like wildfire through the Spanish community in Manila. It hit all their deepest anxieties.
So Governor Acuña reacts. He doesn't wait. He prepares for the worst. What specific military preparations did he start making that the Chinese community in the Parian would have definitely noticed?
Acuna took several steps that were highly provocative, seen from the Parian. He ordered a ramp-up in weapons manufacturing inside Intramuros. He forced a formal registration of all Chinese residents, basically, counting them.
Uh-oh.
And critically, he ordered the demolition of any Chinese houses or structures that stood too close to the city walls of Intramuros.
Clearing lines of fire.
Exactly. So if you're a Sangli living in the Parian, already feeling confined, taxed, distrusted, what do these actions look like?
It looks exactly like the Spanish are preparing to attack you, preparing for a preemptive massacre.
It becomes a terrifying, self-fulfilling prophecy. The Spanish prepare to massacre the Chinese because they think the Chinese are about to invade. The Chinese see the Spanish preparations and they become convinced the Spanish are about to massacre them.
Which leads directly to the preemptive Chinese uprising.
The Chinese community, or at least a significant faction within it, decided they had to strike first to survive. They started planning a revolt.
But it didn't stay secret.
No. The plan was betrayed. The key informant was the Christian Chinese mayor, or Capitan Chino, a man named Juan Bautista de Vera.
He told the Spanish.
He did. The Spanish authorities searched his property, found stashes of gunpowder confirming their fears, and they immediately arrested and executed him.
And his execution was the final spark?
That was it. It triggered open hostilities on October 3rd, 1603. The planned uprising became a desperate, reactive fight.
And the initial Spanish military response. It didn't go well for them, did it? There was this commander, Dasmariñas.
Luis Pérez Dasmariñas. He was actually the son of a previous governor, and he seems to have been completely blinded by that old Spanish arrogance, that fantasy of easy conquest.
The 25 Spaniards are enough guy.
That's the one. The sources quote him dismissing warnings about the train by saying something like, 25 Spaniards were enough to conquer the whole of China. He then rashly pursued the first wave of rebels into this swampy, difficult area.
Big mistake.
Huge mistake. He and a large number of his soldiers were quickly ambushed, surrounded, and killed. This initial, quite humiliating defeat for the Spanish probably solidified their terror and, frankly, fueled the absolute brutality of their counterattack once they regrouped.
But the Sangli rebels, even though they had numbers, they couldn't actually take the fortified city of Intramuros.
No. They lacked the necessary organization, leadership, and crucially, the heavy, coordinated firepower. They apparently built siege towers, used scaling ladders, but the Spanish artillery mounted on those thick city walls just tore their assaults apart.
So once the Spanish military, maybe with their Filipino and even Japanese allies, got organized,
the uprising quickly shifted from anything resembling a pitched battle into an outright massacre.
and the accounts describe just weeks of systematic slaughter.
It was utterly brutal. The Spanish forces, fueled by terror, revenge, and that underlying policy of demographic control, systematically hunted down Sanglis outside the walls. The numbers are debated, as always.
But high.
Extremely high. Contemporary Spanish sources claim they killed maybe 15,000. Some Chinese sources push the figure up towards 25,000. Whatever the exact number, tens of thousands were slaughtered in just a few weeks. It was a massive, violent solution to the Spanish demographic problem.
And then, almost immediately after this horrific violence, comes the ultimate display of colonial cynicism in the aftermath.
It's quite stunning. The Spanish leadership instantly realized, oh, wait, we've just killed off the entire workforce, the artisans, the traders, the people who actually keep Manila functioning, and the galleon trade going.
So what did they do?
With breathtaking speed, they just pivoted. They started sending out messages, reassuring the few thousand Chinese who had survived or were hiding, telling them it was safe to come back. That trade would resume immediately. Business as usual.
Unbelievable. They needed the silk, they needed the porcelain, they needed that silver flow to restart. Like yesterday?
The economic necessity trumped everything, even the recent memory of mass slaughter.
Okay, but what about the Ming government back in China? Surely, news of a massacre of potentially 25,000 of their subjects overseas, that must have provoked a massive reaction. Did they send an avenging fleet?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But no, they did not.
Nothing.
Well, not nothing, but effectively nothing punitive. When the report eventually reached the court in Beijing and communication took months, remember the Ming officials basically did two things.
Stop.
First, they condemned the original envoys, Zhang Yi and his cronies, the ones who started the Gold Mountain lie. They blamed them for deceiving the imperial court and ultimately causing the deaths of all those merchants. Zhang Yi was apparently condemned.
So they blame their own guys. And second,
they issued a formal diplomatic protest, a demand that the Spanish governor, the Luzon ruler, be punished for the killings. But it was toothless. There was no threat of military action behind it.
Why not? Why such a weak response from a major empire?
Ultimately, the Ming court seemed to decide that these Chinese merchants who chose to go overseas and live among foreigners, among savages as they might have seen them, were kind of antagonists, not really victims deserving imperial protection. They'd chosen their own risky fate.
Wow. Abandon them.
Essentially, yes. Plus, and this is critical, the Ming Empire was already consumed by far more immediate existential threats much closer to home. A massacre happening thousands of miles away in the Philippines just wasn't their top priority.
That failure to act by the Ming, that silence from Beijing, it's really the other crucial half of this whole tragic story, isn't it?
It absolutely is. To understand why this massive, powerful Ming dynasty couldn't or wouldn't project its power to protect its own people overseas, you really have to look inward. You have to look at the deep structural decay and the escalating fiscal collapse happening within China itself.
It wasn't that they didn't care at all, maybe, but that they just couldn't.
Couldn't is a big part of it. Imagine you're a mid-level official, let's call him Magistrate Li, working in the Ministry of Rights or War in Beijing around 1603, 1604. A smuggled report arrives, maybe hidden in a merchant's belongings, detailing these horrors from Manila.
Okay.
He takes it to his superiors, maybe hoping for outrage, for action, but instead he's met with exhaustion, weariness, because his superior's desk is already piled high with urgent memorials about the disaster unfolding up north with the Manchu, or reports of peasant uprisings in Shandong.
The empire was already fighting for its life at home.
Precisely. Why did the Ming Empire, which was still arguably the world's largest economy at that point, stand silent? What was the immediate, crippling financial problem that somehow outweighed the massacre of potentially 25,000 of its subjects?
It comes back to money, doesn't it?
Always. The core issue was internal rot and fiscal collapse. We talked about the Wanli Emperor using eunuch tax commissioners like Gao Kai, the Gold Mountain guy, to find funds. That wasn't just personal greed, though there was plenty of that. It was symptomatic of the fact that the formal government financial system was breaking down.
The official channels weren't working anymore.
Right. The emperor was bypassing his own ministries because the established tax system could no longer generate enough revenue to fund the gigantic military apparatus the empire needed to survive.
And where was all the money going? What were the big drains?
Primarily military expenditure. The Ming were pouring colossal amounts of silver into defending the northern frontiers against the rising power of the Manchus, who were getting stronger and more aggressive every year. And simultaneously, they were trying to suppress larger and larger peasant rebellions breaking out across the provinces.
Bleeding silver on two massive fronts, internal and external.
Exactly. And this leads directly to the thing that really pushed Ming society towards the breaking point: the absolutely crushing burden of informal taxation.
Informal taxation, meaning not the regular taxes.
Right. The Ming system didn't collapse because its official land tax or commercial taxes were necessarily too high in theory. It collapsed under the weight of these constant, arbitrary emergency surcharges that were piled on top of the regular taxes whenever the government faced a crisis, which by the early 17th century was all the time.
So imagine being a farmer. You pay your normal land tax, and then suddenly the magistrate shows up demanding more money for some new, vaguely defined military campaign fund.
That's exactly what was happening. Our fictional magistrate Li in Beijing, his records would be full of these dreaded new levies. They became notorious, the three military campaign taxes.
The Liao tax, the Jiao tax, and the Lian tax.
Yes. These weren't permanent institutionalized taxes. They were introduced as temporary emergency measures, starting around 1618 and really ramping up through the 1620s and 1630s.
And they were specifically to pay for
fighting the Manchus, the Liao tax for Liaodong, suppressing internal rebels, the Jiao tax for bandit suppression, and funding military training and provisioning, the Lian tax. These things just dramatically increase the tax burden on the ordinary peasantry, who are already often living right on the edge of subsistence.
And we actually know statistically what impact this had.
We do. Modern research looking at local gazetteers and records from the late Ming has found a really devastatingly direct correlation. Get this. A 1% increase in overall taxation corresponded to roughly a 3.3% increase in reported incidents of peasant unrest.
Wow. A direct link between taxes and rebellion.
Absolutely direct. So you have this combined effect. Skyrocketing, unpredictable taxes hitting people at the same time as you often had natural disasters, floods, droughts, famines, which were also common in this period. It was the perfect storm. It drove desperate peasants and, just as critically, unpaid and starving soldiers into open, massive rebellion across the Chinese heartland.
So Going back to our magistrate Li, he gets this scroll about the Manila Massacre, but he literally can't even get his superiors to focus on it because they're trying to figure out how to stop Li Zicheng's rebel army, which is marching towards the capital, funded by peasants fleeing these crazy taxes.
That's the tragic reality of the situation. The Ming court was facing truly existential threats. The Manchus were successfully breaching the Great Wall passes in the north. Huge peasant armies were carving up the interior provinces. In that context, they simply lacked the resources, the spare military capacity, the ships, the silver, the political focus, the will to intervene thousands of miles away in the Philippines.
So the same immense distance that had ironically protected the Ming from that Spanish Empresa de China
Now prevented the Ming from projecting power outwards to protect its own people.
Yeah.
The vulnerability cut both ways.
So the report about the 1603 massacre, it arrives, maybe gets read, debated briefly, and then just filed away somewhere. It becomes a symbol of the limits of protection.
You could call it the silence of impotence. A once mighty empire watching helplessly or perhaps just distractedly as its overseas communities were being systematically destroyed. For the late Ming dynasty, the crisis wasn't overseas. The house was burning down from the inside.
Okay, so the 1603 massacre happens. It's horrific. The Ming response is basically non-existent due to their own internal chaos. But the fundamental paradox in Manila hasn't gone away, has it?
Not at all. The Spanish brutally solved their immediate demographic problem in 1603, but they still desperately needed Chinese labor, Chinese artisans, and Chinese merchants for the galleon trade to function. The economic engine hadn't changed.
So inevitably, the Chinese population starts to creep back up.
It's actually astounding how quickly it recovered. It just reveals how essential they were. Despite maybe 25,000 deaths in 1603, by 1639, so about 36 years later, the Chinese population in and around Manila had exploded again. Estimates put it somewhere between 33,000 and maybe even 45,000 residents.
Back to, or even exceeding, the pre-1603 levels.
Exactly. The sheer demand for their skills and the pull of the silver trade completely outweighed the memory of the violence, both for the migrants coming from Fujian and for the Spanish allowing them in.
But of course, once that population grows again and you get some kind of economic shock or Spanish pressure, you're right back to the same dangerous dynamic. Which leads us to the next major explosion, the 1639 rebellion.
Right. Same pattern, different trigger.
What was the specific spark this time? Was it another invasion scare?
No, this one seems more rooted in direct economic hardship and Spanish labor policies. Firstly, the galleon trade apparently had a particularly bad year leading up to 1639, which would have increased economic stress and perhaps desperation among the Sanglais.
Okay, so money's tight.
Money's tight. But the more critical factor seems to have been the Spanish authorities starting to forcibly conscript rural Chinese residents, those living outside the Parian, perhaps farmers or artisans in the provinces, into really harsh forced labor.
Forced labor doing what?
Working on crown-owned agricultural estates, specifically one mentioned at Calamba, the conditions reported there were horrific, essentially worked to death. Sources mention nearly 300 Chinese laborers had died at Calamba from mistreatment before the rebellion even broke out in November 1639.
So the Chinese community, seeing this forced labor, maybe remembering 1603, feeling economically squeezed, they lash out against the coercion.
It seems so. They rebelled, presumably trying to resist being dragged off to these death trap farms. But again, despite their numbers, they were likely poorly armed, poorly organized compared to the Spanish military and their local Filipino allies.
And the Spanish response? Was it panic or more calculated this time?
The sources suggest it was immediate, brutal, and perhaps even more systematic than in 1603. This time, the authorities didn't just react, they actively incentivized the killing. They offered official rewards, basically bounties, for each Chinese head brought in.
A bounty system for ethnic cleansing.
That's exactly what it looks like, institutionalized violence. The outcome was, predictably, another horrific large-scale slaughter. The estimates this time range from about 17,000 to maybe 22,000 Chinese residents killed.
Almost as many as 1603.
Yeah. It's a clear, chilling demonstration that the massacre wasn't just a one-off accident born of panic in 1603. It had become, it seems, a reliable, recurring tool in the Spanish colonial playbook for managing demographic anxieties and responding to economic stress or resistance. Kill them off, then let them come back when you need them again.
A deeply cynical cycle. And it wasn't always triggered by internal issues like labor disputes, right? The final major incident we need to touch on shows how external geopolitical shifts could light the same fuse. This is the Kaksinga Scare and the 1662 Massacre.
Right. This time, the trigger comes from outside the Philippines entirely. The year is 1662. There's been a massive shift in power in the region.
Koxinga. Yeah.
Sheng Chenggong, this famous Ming loyalist, pirate warlord operating from a naval base in Fujian, has just done something incredible. He successfully kicked the Dutch out of Taiwan, Formosa.
A major European power defeated.
Exactly. So Koxinga is feeling powerful, emboldened. He controls a significant naval and military force, and he decides to turn his attention south. He sends a pretty blunt ultimatum to the Spanish governor in Manila.
Demanding what?
Demanding tribute. Basically, acknowledge him as the regional power and pay up or face the consequences.
So Manila, already prone to invasion scares, gets this threat from a guy who just beat the Dutch. They must have panicked.
Absolute panic plunged the city. They were terrified. Koxinga would make the Philippines his next target after Taiwan. But the fear wasn't just about an external invasion fleet appearing.
It was internal again. Fear of the local Chinese.
Always. The Spanish governor at the time, Sabiniano Manrique de Lara, became utterly convinced that the local Chinese community, which, again, numbered in the tens of thousands by this point, would inevitably side with Koxinga. They'd rise up from within the moment his ships appeared on the horizon. A fifth column.
So rather than wait and see,
he chose the familiar preemptive strategy. He instigated conflict, likely based on suspicion and fear, rather than any concrete evidence of a plot.
And the result was another massacre.
Followed the same horrific pattern. The Spanish authorities, perhaps with local allies, launched a targeted slaughter to eliminate this perceived internal threat before Koxinga could even arrive, which, incidentally, he never did. He died shortly after.
How many were killed this time?
Estimates vary again, but somewhere in the range of 10,000 to 15,000 Chinese residents were killed in 1662. Many apparently died drowning as they desperately tried to flee Manila by boat.
So whether the trigger was a fake gold mountain, forced labor, or a geopolitical threat, the outcome was brutally consistent.
It really was. This cycle just seems relentless throughout the 17th century. The Chinese population tolerated Spanish control, the segregation, the taxes, because the profits from the galleon trade were just too immense to pass up.
And the Spanish tolerated the huge Chinese numbers and their commercial dominance only because they absolutely needed them for that same trade. It was this deeply unstable, mutually dependent, yet mutually suspicious relationship.
A fragile cohabitation. And it meant that any major shock, an economic downturn, a plausible invasion scare, a heavy-handed Spanish policy could immediately turn the Parian from an economic engine into a killing field. Violence became the default management tool. #outro. So if we try to pull all these threads together, synthesize the evidence we've looked at, the real tragedy of these recurring Manila massacres isn't just about a single lie or simple panic or even just racism, though that was present. It stems from this deep underlying structural instability.
Right. That Gold Mountain story was just the match dropped into the tinderbox.
Exactly. The Spanish Empire was structurally paralyzed, wasn't it? Hemmed in by impossible logistics, distracted by European wars, unable to actually achieve its grand imperial dream in Asia. And that resulted in this profound insecurity, this constant paranoia in Manila.
While at the same time, the Ming dynasty, the only power that could have theoretically stepped in to protect the diaspora,
was itself crippled by internal fiscal decay, corruption, facing existential threats from Manchu invaders and peasant revolts. It just didn't have the capacity or maybe the political will to project power outwards.
So the massive Chinese community in Manila ends up trapped, crushed in this fatal 1,000-mile-wide gap between two failing, inward-looking imperial systems.
Yeah. Their colonial hosts, the Spanish, desperately needed their economic contribution, but lived in mortal fear of their numbers. And their powerful homeland, the Ming, was too consumed by its own death throes to offer any meaningful protection.
It leads you to this final, really provocative thought, doesn't it? The ultimate bitter tragedy for the 17th century Chinese diaspora in Manila is that the very thing that drew them there, their incredible commercial success, the success that basically created the first truly global trade network linking American silver with Asian goods, that very success simultaneously guaranteed their periodic mass destruction.
Because that success, that essential contribution, was perceived by their colonial hosts, not as a partnership, not as a strength for the colony,
but as an existential threat. A threat that had to be violently, brutally managed again and again.